Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. Okay, so before I start the script here, although I did script this too, I wanted to just clarify, just so Old Man Flappy Nuts knows, that I was not criticizing him when I was castigating men who are afraid of coronavirus, just so he knows. The only reasonable argument to avoid getting coronavirus if you're young and healthy is the argument that Old Man Flappy Nuts made, which is that if coronavirus causes organ damage or infertility, then it's better to avoid getting the virus. I definitely tend toward the side of like, I don't think you should be afraid of it anyway, even if you don't know whether it could do that. But yeah, if you like definitely know that the odds are like very high if you get it that you are going to end up infertile or something, then yeah, that probably is a pretty good reason to try to avoid getting it, right? But yeah, if you don't know that it causes damage, then I wouldn't be afraid of getting it. Or if you get it and there's only like a 5% chance of ending up infertile, then yeah, you might want to. It'd probably be a good idea to roll those dice because it'll make your immune system stronger. You know what I mean? But yeah, I wasn't criticizing him. I was criticizing all the cowardly liberals and conservatives out there who are so scared of coronavirus. It's ridiculous. Old Man Flappy Nuts made the only good argument that can be made for avoiding getting coronavirus if you're a young, healthy person, which is that if it causes organ damage or infertility, then you'd want to avoid it. And I definitely tend to agree with it with those stipulations that I mentioned earlier in those limitations, But other people are not making that argument that you don't get coronavirus because it could cause damage or organ damage or infertility. Most cowards out there, that's not the argument they're making. So I can't countenance their cowardice because they're not making an intelligent argument as to why they should avoid getting coronavirus like Old Man Flappy Nuts did, So they're not approaching the issue from a rational perspective like Old Man Flappy Nuts is. They're instead approaching the issue of coronavirus from a perspective of cowardice. They just don't want to suffer. They don't want to risk even the tiniest chance they might die, even though it will make them stronger if they survive. And the odds of death if you're young and healthy and have no risk factors is probably 1% chance of death or lower. So, it's, like I said, if you're young and healthy. So I just want to make it clear that I was not criticizing Old Man Flappy Nuts or his position on coronavirus, which is an intelligent position. I was criticizing other people. I often unload, and it seems like I'm angry or vicious toward someone who I'm actually not being angry or vicious toward, right? Sometimes it seems like I'm overly critical of Zeitgeist Eater when I make a video response to him, although if I'm angry in the video, it's often because I'm angry at my other subscribers who've been leaving retarded comments that relate to what he was saying. So it might seem like I'm angry at him when I'm really not. But regarding Old Man Flappy Nuts' response to my video, MGTOW is dysgenic, not to be unkind, but I think he might want to listen to the video again. I think that people who listen to my videos at more than normal speed, like 1.5 times or 2 times speed, I think they probably miss a lot of the chains of logic that I'm talking about. People can't typically process information that quickly, and so I think if people watch my videos on normal speed instead of on faster than normal speed, I think they'll have more time to process what I'm saying, and then I think they'll be able to understand me easier, and then I think what I'm saying will make more sense to them. I think it's undeniable that MGTOW is dysgenic. Not just in the sense of MGTOW men not passing on their above-average genes, but also in the sense of MGTOW men's promiscuity creating a scarcity of female sex, that is, female sexual availability, female libido, scarcity of female libido, and an entitlement in women because, as other MGTOW men have said, it makes women think that they can get an 8 out of 10 man or a 9 out of 10 man just because she can get such a guy to sleep with her, right? And she doesn't realize that she can't get him to settle down with her, right? So she spends her 20s sleeping with such guys and trying to find one who will commit to her and who will live up to her extremely unrealistically high expectations. Expectations which only get higher due to women no longer being able to pair bond and thus wanting Mr. Perfect, because if she can't have love because of her no longer being able to pair bond, then she figures she damn well better make sure she gets Mr. Perfect, because only Mr. Perfect will be even a halfway decent substitute for being with a guy who she truly loves. And, she can't be with the guy who she truly loves because either she used up her pair bonding ability on him, but now she doesn't like him anymore because, they destroyed their relationship or whatever because they're too young. They're both too immature or whatever because they started having sex at like 16 or whatever. Or, whatever other reason, So, like, since she can't love anymore, she wants Mr. Perfect because he's the only substitute for a guy who, who she would really be able to love. Right, so, they stay out of the market for almost their whole span of beauty by just riding the carousel, out of the market for guys that are those women's own SMV. So they stay out of the market for the guys who they should be settling down with, right? So this raises women's SMV and lowers bottom 80% men's SMV. Maybe it even lowers the bottom 85% or 90% of men's SMV. And this creates gynocentrism. And these women would not be able to get away with this, though, because the only reason they're getting away with this is because they're settling down when they're 30 or 35 for some simp who settles for her, right? But why is he settling for her? Because it's so hard to find a woman. Why is it so hard to find a woman? Because of the shortage of women. Why is there a shortage of women? Because of the promiscuity of the top men using up way more than their fair share of women, way more than their fair share of sexual libido, sexual female interest, etc., etc. So if men were refusing to, settle down with these 30, 35-year-old women and were letting them hit the wall and end up childless and single, then yeah, women would stop, riding the carousel, or they'd start being polygynous. But men aren't doing that, and until MGTOW gets way, way, way bigger, men are not even going to think about not doing that anymore. Settling down to women who are 30 or 35. So women continue to get away with it. So they are out of the market for men of their own SMV. Men of their own SMV can't get women of their own SMV, right? This competition over women creates gynocentrism, and this gynocentrism lowers male SMV and raises female SMV. This is a fact. It's basic economics. And this fact means that if a guy is going to be able to get a woman, he is forced to settle for a woman who is below his own SMV, unless, of course, he's charming or good looking. But, of course, that would mean he's probably above average in SMV. And remember, because we live in a gynocentric society, women do not equally value guys of the same SMV. This is really important to understand. There can be two guys who are both 7 out of 10, but they're 7 out of 10 in different ways. And women are not going to appreciate those two guys in the same way. Right? There could be, one 7 out of 10 guy who seems like a 3 out of 10 to her because she can't understand or appreciate his qualities, like his intelligence or his morality or whatever. And another guy might only be a 5 out of 10 in reality, right? So one guy's a 7 out of 10 in reality, another guy's a 5 out of 10 in reality, but he's not as smart or as moral as a 7 out of 10 guy. But yet because this 5 out of 10 guy is good looking and or charming, she might think that he's a 7 or an 8 out of 10. Even though he's actually only a 5 out of 10. So you could be a 7 out of 10 and be viewed by women as a 3 out of 10. Or you can be a 5 out of 10 and be viewed by women as being a 7 or an 8 out of 10. And I'm not talking about like specific women. Women have different tastes. And so, one woman views a guy as a 3 and another woman views that same guy as a 7. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about on average. Like a 7 out of 10 guy could be viewed by, 1,000 women as being on average. Most of them view him as a 3 out of 10. And then, take a 5 out of 10 guy who's much better looking, and this guy, and more charming perhaps too, but not as smart, not as moral, not as disciplined, etc. And then this 5 out of 10 guy could be viewed as like a 7 out of 10 by, 1,000 women on average. On average, 1,000 women view this guy as being a 7 out of 10. So like real SMV doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, real SMV doesn't really have anything to do with perceived SMV. But that's the way it is in society because women are in charge. Women are the ones setting the terms because of the promiscuity of top men, meaning women's insane determination of what, a guy's SMV is, which is often completely inaccurate. This is now the new, SMV that society is functioning on, even though it isn't those guys' true SMV. You see? Like I said, because the guy could be just good looking and a little bit charming, she thinks he's a 7 out of 10, when really he's only 5 out of 10. So just because two guys might have the same SMV, or the corollary of this is, to make it more clear, like that was an example of like a 7 out of 10 guy versus a 5 out of 10 guy, but there could be a 7 out of 10 guy who's like really smart and really moral and really disciplined and really healthy, and women view him as like a 4 or a 5 out of 10 because he's not all that good looking and he's not charming and stuff, you know what I mean? Maybe he's well-spoken, but he doesn't have charisma, he's not entertaining, he's not funny. So, most women view the 7 out of 10 guy as like 4 or 5 out of 10. There's another 7 out of 10 guy who's very charming, very funny, very personable, and maybe not as healthy, and maybe not as intelligent, maybe not as moral. But because he's funny and because he's really good looking, women view this 7 out of 10 guy as like 7 out of 10. Right? So one 7 out of 10 guy they view as like 4 or 5, another 7 out of 10 guy they view as a 7 or even an 8. Right? So if guys could be the exact same, SMV, but they're they have good qualities that are different. But if the guy has the good qualities that women like, he's good looking and entertaining, then she'll think that his SMV is higher than this other guy whose SMV is in a form that she can't appreciate, like intelligence and morality, because women are irrational and amoral, so they can't understand a guy's intelligence or his morality, so they don't appreciate it. You see, so just because two guys are the same SMV doesn't mean they are perceived to have the same SMV. You see, so this is something that you also have to really, really understand. It's super important to understand that, right? So just because two guys might have the same SMV, it doesn't mean they're going to possess the same SMV in the same way. And this means that women can view different guys of the same SMV as being radically different in SMV. Not because of personality differences even necessarily, though, which will, not in terms of like personality differences which will make her mesh worse or better with various guys, but just because her criteria are shallow and foolish, and she never even gives a chance to the guys who are in the same who are the same in SMV, but seem to her to be much lower in SMV, right? So since this is the case, this means that a lot of guys are above average. They're 6 out of 10 or even 7 out of 10 in SMV, in actual SMV, right? And these guys are forced to settle for a woman way below their own SMV, such as 7 out of 10 guys settling for a 5 out of 10, or even a 4 out of 10, and 6 out of 10 guys having to settle for a 4 out of 10, or sometimes even a 3 out of 10, right? Like, this means that these guys who have to settle for women significantly below their own SMV are going to have kids that are dumber and uglier and less healthy than if these guys had been able to marry a woman of their own SMV, such as a 6 out of 10 guy marrying a 6 out of 10 woman. So his kids will be worse because he had to marry a 4 out of 10 woman instead of a 6 out of 10 woman. So his kids will be dumber, uglier, etc. So that's the definition of dysgenics, when your kids are worse, right? And the shortage of women means that the women at the bottom will be more easily able to get a guy, and get a guy above her own SMV, such as 2 out of 10 women getting 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 guys. And then those guys might be able to afford to give her kids, when in a society where there was true monogamy, such as in the past, it'd be a situation of such a woman probably not being able to find a husband, and thus she would not be passing on her bad 2 out of 10 genes. But today she gets to breed, which is dysgenic. And because of the promiscuity of the top men creating gynocentrism in society, this means that gynocentric laws can be passed. Laws such as welfare for single mothers, which is something that would never be tolerated if we did not live in a gynocentric society. And the only reason society is gynocentric is because of the promiscuity of men, especially top men. But, any men who are being promiscuous, actually. And good-looking, charming men who are amoral, who are at the bottom of society as well. These men are typically promiscuous as well. These guys also don't give a damn about the consequences of their actions, and so they're often promiscuous as well. These guys at the bottom of society, or they're too stupid to understand the destructiveness of their promiscuity. The guys at the top are typically too psychopathic to care. They're totally elitist. They don't give a shit about men, even though they may act like they do if they're in MGTOW. But it's the bottom men who are probably too stupid to understand the destructiveness of their promiscuity. And because of the gynocentric society, right, because of the gynocentric society, because of society being gynocentric laws are created, laws like welfare. And then this welfare allows 2 out of 10 women to breed even more than they could by getting a guy above her own SMV, who therefore by definition pretty much usually has more money. So this is dysgenic as well. I don't see how anyone could argue with this. It's pretty much undeniable. So I'm kind of confused as to why Old Man Flappy Nuts seemed to disagree with me in the comment on that video. He seemed to not think that I'd proven what I said in my video, or maybe he just was trying to point out that I was not speaking terribly, detailedly, in great detail about IQ, but that's something I addressed in another comment another video where I do a bunch of responses to comments, including that comment by Old Man Flappy Nuts. But basically, it would have taken too long to get into all the details of IQ and stuff, and it didn't really change the dynamics of what I said in that video anyway. So there's really no need to go into the specifics about IQ in that video. It doesn't, being more specific about IQ, the Flynn effect and general intelligence and all that, it didn't really change the argument I was making in that video. So either he agrees with me in my fundamental argument in that video, or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, I don't really understand why he doesn't, because I thought I proved pretty well what I said in that video. And even if I hadn't, regarding the welfare aspect, the other aspects of it are still true. MGTOW is still dysgenic because the top MGTOW men are not breeding at all. And they are forcing the middle-class men to get with women below their own SMV, which never happened in the past. And so, at least not in monogamous countries over the last couple hundred years or last 300 or 400 years or whatever. That did not happen. Men were able to get women to their own SMV, and that is dysgenic as well. A guy breeding with a 6 out of 10 guy breeding with a 4 out of 10 woman instead of with a 6 out of 10 woman like you should be able to get, that is inherently dysgenic. So that makes MGTOW, if not quadruply dysgenic due to welfare, if you don't want to agree with me about that, MGTOW is still dysgenic in two ways, which is, the top men are not breeding at all. The top MGTOW men are not breeding at all, even though they're fucking hundreds of women. And they're forcing the SMV of regular guys to be lower so that the regular guys have to marry women much worse than them, and then their kids are much worse than they otherwise would be if those middle-class guys who are breeding had been able to get a woman of their own SMV. So even if you don't agree with MGTOW being quadruply dysgenic, it is definitely at least doubly dysgenic, and that's really undebatable, I think. So I hope Old Man Flappy Nuts listens to the video again at regular speed, and maybe he will agree with me more then after having listened to it at regular speed. And regarding his comment, he said that it's easier to breed now than ever before. I strongly disagree with this. Sure, it was harder to breed millions of years ago, and maybe even thousands of years ago, especially if you were a slave or a guy with bad genes, but I don't think there's any debate about the fact that it's harder to breed now than it ever has been in American history. There was little or no gynocentrism earlier in American history, especially in the 1800s and 1700s. Even in the first half of the 1900s, there was hardly any gynocentrism. Even back in the 1970s, there was way less gynocentrism than there is now. Men had a higher SMV and women had a lower SMV, and thus men could get a woman who had the same SMV as him. There was way less taxation and way less tyranny. The cost of rent was way lower. And the cost of food was higher regarding like what percentage of your paycheck you typically had to spend on rent and what percentage you typically had to spend on food. It's flipped. In the past, rent was much cheaper and the cost of food is much higher. Now it's flipped, and now the cost of food is a much smaller percentage of your paycheck, and the cost of rent is a much higher percentage of your paycheck. But you can decide how much less food you're going to eat. You can eat way less food. You can eat 1 or 2 meals a day. You can, not keep on a bunch of muscle mass. You can do things to make it so you don't have to eat as much food, or you can buy food in bulk or eat very cheap food, so you can bring down the cost of your food. You cannot necessarily bring down the cost of your rent very easily, especially since there's government tyranny in the form of regulations that don't let there be tiny little housing structures like in Mexico and other places that you could rent out for like $100 or $200, like that just doesn't exist in America. So you can't, it's not a matter of like, living beyond your means. It's that they don't make places to live that are tiny and super cheap. So how can you lower the cost of your rent? So it was actually better in the past when rent was cheaper and food was more expensive, because you could always cut down on how much you eat. You know what I mean? Or you could eat cheaper or whatever. Buy in bulk. Whatever, but you can't do that with rent, at least not in this country where it's over regulation and stuff. So, it really was better back then when there was less taxation, less tyranny, rent was cheaper. So there's a much, much higher standard of living in the past throughout all of American history. There was a far lower population as well, and thus all people in the country had a higher value, because the greater the population gets. Now you may say, oh, our population is low compared to China. Yeah, but this is not a relative thing. It's not related to other countries. It just has, it doesn't even matter how, China could have 50 billion people and we could have the same amount of people we have in our country, and it wouldn't change the dynamic at all regarding, the fact that the greater the population gets, the more human life's value goes down. This is absolute fact. This is absolutely undeniable. It's basic economics. What is abundant is not worth much. What is rare is worth a lot. That's why in the past, human life had great value, and there's great compassion and great cohesiveness for other people and generosity and all kinds of stuff, because humanity was not super abundant. But when humanity is super abundant, human life becomes cheap, just like dirt, just like, wood or iron. It's not worth much. So then, everybody treats each other like shit, and plus, the more people that are on the earth, it's the situation of there's less land. The planet's not growing like the population is, so the amount of land, it never increases. You know what I mean? So the population goes up, and so, the cost of rent just goes up with it. This is basically inevitable. It could be way lower, rent could be, but it still inevitably has to go up, the cost of rent, as the human population goes up. So since there are less people on the earth, including in America in the past, everybody had a higher value in terms of, basic humanity, and rent was cheaper. And there was also no financial shenanigans like quantitative easing, making rent even higher, right? For that reason as well. I mean, it's higher just naturally because of the greater population, but it's even higher after 2008 because of all the quantitative easing. And so, this means that people back then, 1950s and earlier, had a way higher, even the 60s, 70s and earlier, they had a way higher standard of living than we do, right? And they didn't have to work as much. And there was also a much lower IQ requirement and memory requirement to get a middle class job back then. You could get a job right out of high school without any special connections or anything. You just decide, yeah, I'm not going to college. You get a job and you work and you make good money, you can get a wife and have kids and everything. Right? Now you got to pretty much get a PhD to get a great job like that. If you want to get a good job straight out of school without having to climb the corporate ladder first, you better either be super smart so you can climb up the ranks without a career, without a degree. But even then, even if you're super smart, they'll often tell you, yeah, you don't have a degree, so we can't promote you. Like, we would like to promote you, but you're going to have to go back to school before we can. So even if you are super smart, your lack of education is like it's like a security clearance. Like, without that higher security clearance, you can't know certain things. Well, without a degree, they won't promote you, even if you are smart enough to do the job that they could promote you to do. You know what I mean? They want to make sure that you have that schooling or whatever for whatever reason. I don't know if that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it is a higher requirement. So now you got to get a PhD or something if you want to get a great job, or at least a bachelor's. And even then, and if you don't get it in the right field, you're not going to make much money. You're just going to be in debt. So I think it's pretty undeniable, at least, that during American history, there's never been a worse time to breed. And while you can breed by living in a commune, there are few, if any, non-religious communes. And so it's very hard to find a commune to join if you're not religious. It's also very hard to find a virgin, especially if you're in your 30s or older, like a lot of guys looking for a wife are. Because, it takes way longer to get prosperous because of the overregulation and the debt and the currency, not being sound money and the taxation. All that makes it so that guys can't breed until they're much older. Guys could get a wife when they're 20, 22, 23, 24, 25. Like, guys usually married, like, let's say 20 to 25 years old. Or 19 to 26 years old. Let's call it 20 to 25 years old. Like 70 years ago, let's say. But now you got to be like 30, 35, even 40 maybe to find a wife. You know what I mean? Before you're making like really good money to where you can, find a wife easily, especially with this kind of centrism, especially if you're only a 5 out of 10 guy in terms of looks and intelligence and all that, right? Which makes it also take longer to make a decent amount of money so you can afford a wife, not only just to attract her, but also to, be able to take care of her and whatnot. So, it's very hard to find a virgin, right? Like, so a lot of guys who are looking for a wife, it's really hard. So things are not better now than ever before in terms of, like, being able to breed. They're worse than they have been ever before. At least if you're talking about, like, in the last 200 to 400 years, or at least 200 to 300 years, right? Like, now maybe you could debate if it's easier now in certain ways to breed or whatever because of maybe if you're poor you can get on welfare, but that's dysgenic breeding. That doesn't count. And mooching off the government, I don't think is a good reason to say that it's easier to breed these days. Especially since they'll put you on child support anyway too, and that's no good. MGTOW's totally right about having to avoid shit like that. MGTOW's wrong about the solution, but it's totally right about having to avoid the effects of legal misandry, right? So unless you're in a commune, one that keeps the cops out with violence, you're not going to be able to keep her from putting you on child support if you have kids. So, it really is the case that, like, it's a situation where it is harder now to breed than ever before. At least harder than it's ever been before in American history. Not to pick on Old Man Flappiness, but I just had to respond to what he said. And yes, I did not script that video, MGTOW's dysgenic. I know it was quite a sloppy-sounding video because of me not having scripted it. But I think the logic goes pretty sound. And like I said, even if you disagree that, promiscuity causes gynocentrism, which causes welfare, even if you disagree with that, you still have to agree that MGTOW is dysgenic in the two ways that I mentioned earlier in this video. But anyway, the other person I want to respond to is Wojak Blues, I think that's his name. He asked what kind of videos he should make. Option 1, making videos about your own unique insights. Option 2, make videos illustrating how female nature works by telling personal stories about your own experiences with women, or experiences with women that you've seen, like, your brother or your cousin, or how your mom acts, or whatever. Doesn't even need to be ex-girlfriends. Option 3, expose feminist and anti-MGTOW propaganda that you see in TV shows, such as that new TV show Motherland, Fort Salem, which I'm probably going to be doing a video about soon. Option 4, read news stories about women behaving badly. Read such articles on a free website like The Guardian, and then maybe read the article and then comment on it. That's what Global Man does. I think he uses the website The Guardian, although maybe there's another website he gets his articles from. I can't remember. Option 5, do other red pill videos, such as videos about Illuminati symbolism, or videos about the numerous false flags our government has used to get us to agree to go to war, or videos about the Wandering Tribe, or videos about fiat currency and sound money, Or you can do videos about all these topics, like I do. The main point is that you try, that you do something, anything, that you just start making content, even if it's crappy. It doesn't matter how crappy it is, at least you're trying. That makes you better than 99% of the men out there who are not making content, who are not fighting evil. I wasn't sure I would have anything to say when I started making content. I just started making content because I thought I might have something worthwhile to say, and I felt a moral obligation to start making content because I had benefited so much from watching, Sandman and Coltane and Coterie videos and stuff, and the conspiracy theory channels and the Sound Money channels. I was like, dude, I've learned so much in the last, couple, 2 or 3 years. It's ridiculous. I've learned so much more than I've ever learned in my whole life, in terms of real knowledge and wisdom and stuff you should know, right? So then I was like, dude, how can I not make content and share, my opinion on stuff, right? I got to make a channel to, I don't know if I'll have anything good to say or whatever, but I'll try and see if I can, do my part. So then I tried, and I found out I did have some things to say. So the important thing is to try, not how good it is. Because even if your channel's crappy, it's another channel out there that people are going to accidentally run into and then think, oh my god, another MGTOW. God damn, this problem is huge. Maybe we do have to do something about this gynocentrism problem. You see, the more people who make channels, the more it convinces the middle of the road and the liberal people that, holy shit, this MGTOW problem, or even if they view those people as incels, they'll be like, this incel problem, it's insane. It's going to get really crazy if we don't fix this problem, right? So then some kind of solution will start to be made, right? About the gynocentrism, about the legal misandry, about the fiat currency, the poverty, et cetera, right? So just by making a channel, even if it's crappy, you are benefiting the world. It doesn't have to be a good channel, right? So this is really, really important to understand. Just start making content. Doesn't matter how unoriginal or crappy it is. Or you can copy other people's videos like mine. Say the same things, but say it funny. If you have a sense of humor, that's a huge advantage. I don't have a sense of humor. I think I like watching humorous TV shows. I laugh and stuff, but I'm terrible at making jokes, So other people who are funny, they could take the same insights that I've had and then make videos about them with nothing original really other than the humor. And then people would love those videos, and then they'd get way more views than my videos do, and then the insights will be getting out there. And then you'll be massively helping the world. The more people are making content, the more women and sheeple will see content like that, and will then start to realize that there are tons of people who believe this stuff. And then women will start being more open-minded about stuff, and will therefore stop being so anti-male, pro-government, etc., and will instead start to stop being such rabid allies of the enemy, and will become more open-minded so that we can turn them to our side, so that we can turn them into our allies. We need to do whatever it takes to win, including forcible mass exsanguination of the scumbags at the top. The consequences of losing are too horrific to imagine, as I've talked about in my videos on pegging. But anyway, onto the original script of the video. It's about prison. There's no reason to have prisons. They seem to legitimize government. Look at it like this. Imprisonment is worse than death. If something is so bad that you have to imprison someone for 20 or more years, then that person should be killed instead. Prison is a cruel and unusual punishment. It's far more humane to kill the person. If what they've done is so bad that that problem cannot be settled on an individual level or a family level or a community level, if it's really so bad that there must be punishment for what the person did, then why not just publicly whip the person? The scars will remind him to never repeat the action that got him whipped. Years of his life are not wasted by whipping him instead of sending him to prison for 2 or 3 or 5 years. And there's not a bunch of money wasted on prison also if you do whipping. And if you say the prison is not costly because they use prisoners as slave labor, well then I will say that with whipping, there's no incentive to put people into prison so as to grow your slave labor force so that you can get rich. So that's another advantage of whipping. The prisoners being used as slave labor today is not a reason to have prison. That's a reason to not have prison. And if what someone has done is so bad that a whipping is not enough, then why not just cut off a finger or his hand or whatever, right? And if what he did was so bad that not even cutting off his hand is sufficient punishment, then he should be killed. There's no need for prison. Killing someone as a punishment is far more humane than putting someone in a rape factory called prison. And it's way more humane than throwing someone in a rape factory called prison for decades. Throwing someone in a rape factory for decades is infinitely more cruel and inhumane than having someone fall into a hole full of spikes smeared with excrement, such as has happened in war. And even if they don't incentivize throwing way more people into prison by making the prisoners do labor for, slave labor for almost free, they still have to pay for the prisons with tax money. And that's oppressive to the middle class who pay those taxes. as well as dysgenic, because then the middle class cannot breed as much because they have less money because of the taxes for the prisons. And then we get fewer high IQ people because of fewer middle class people breeding. And top people don't breed much, so the only way you get high IQ people is the middle class people who have high IQs breeding a lot, which they can't do if taxation is high. And having a very frequently used death penalty, such as was the case a few hundred years ago, that's actually eugenic, as Michael A. Woodley and Edward Dutton talk about in their book At Our Wit's End. Michael A. Woodley also talked about it in his interview on Stefan Molyneux's show. So there's no reason to imprison people at all. If you punish way fewer crimes and let individuals and families and communities deal with most problems and only punish the most severe crimes, and only punish severe crimes with either whipping, the loss of a finger or a hand, or with execution, well then far fewer people will misbehave, and there will be no threat of prison, no prison labor, and far fewer laws, and thus far more freedom, and you won't have the situation of people going to prison and being branded a felon and being unable to get a job, and then you won't have the situation of people then being forced to return to crime because of them being unable to get a good job because of being branded a felon. And then you won't have the situation of people getting even better at crime in prison because of spending lots of time talking to criminals, so that the prisoners go into prison with a high school degree worth of crime knowledge, and then they come out of prison with a PhD in crime because of talking to all the other criminals and learning a ton. And so, they have no other skills to go back to, so then they just go back to committing crimes again when they get out, especially thinking, I can get away with it now, I know way more than before, right? And since they're branded felons, they have no future anyway. We should not be branding people as felons. It's ridiculous. We should instead have a reputation network run by the public so that even if you commit a crime, if you have a good score on the reputation network, people will trust you because you can make up for your crime by, improving your score by being good from then on. Your score will get higher and higher and higher, despite you having committed a bad deed way in the past, right? And then you'll be able to get good employment and be friends with people and everything else, right? Then that past deed that you did won't ruin your life. Permanently branding people as a felon ruins their lives, and it is destructive because then they return to crime when they otherwise probably would not have done so if they had not been branded a felon. Right? We shouldn't even have the designation felony or felon. Now some people will object and say that my suggestion is horrible because we'd end up executing way more innocent people, and I will respond that it's better to be executed accidentally, even though you're innocent, than it is to be convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison, even though you're innocent, because being executed doesn't remove your human dignity. But being thrown in prison and raped over and over by other men for decades is something that removes your human dignity, and is a fate far worse than death. Executing innocent people is far more humane than throwing them in prison for life. And when you have a prison system, innocent people do go to prison, and horrible things often happen to them in prison. If there's no God, well then they would have died of old age anyway. And if there is a God or karma or reincarnation or some kind of life after death, well then that universal force, whatever it is, will recompense the innocent person who is executed for a crime that he did not commit. And he'll be reborn in heaven, or he'll be reborn the son of a rich family, or whatever. He'll get some kind of reward for having lost his life unnecessarily. The universe will recompense him. Or if there's no God, in which case it doesn't even matter. Either way, there's not any need to worry too much about the few people who will be executed even though they're innocent if we have a very robust death penalty. And if you were to give the criminals, or supposed criminals, a choice between execution or being thrown in prison where they might be raped over and over again for decades, I think a lot of people would choose execution instead of prison. And the fact that many convicted criminals themselves would choose execution would prove that death is a more humane punishment than prison is, or at least when prison's a rape factory like it is. Now, some people will object and say it's only a small percentage of prisoners who admit to being sexually assaulted, but I will point out that such a form of sexual abuse is far more embarrassing, and shame-inducing, and so I bet the percentage of men who admit to being sexually assaulted in prison is probably far lower than the percentage who are actually assaulted. I mean, they always say, women don't report rape, so, the number's way higher than the reported women who actually admit rape or report rape, right? Well, same thing about men in prison. Right? Like maybe only 5% have the guts to admit it, but maybe actually 30% are being sexually assaulted. So, the real number of prisoners who are sexually assaulted may actually be much higher than we think. And besides, if you had a choice between being executed or thrown into a prison where you had a 5% chance of not being just raped, but being raped repeatedly for years, if you had a 5% chance of being raped, and not just raped once, but raped over and over and over again, which would you choose? Execution or getting raped over and over again by other guys, right? If you're a guy, which would you choose? I think a lot of people would choose to be executed. Even if it's a 5% chance, that's pretty low chance, but still, the consequences of being that happening to you, being one of those 5%, is so horrific that, you know, I think a lot of people would choose to be executed rather than face that chance. You know what I'm saying? And it's such a horrifying thing if you're straight. You know what I mean? If you're gay, it's probably not as bad, but if you're straight, that's horrific. You know what I mean? So, you know, even if you murdered someone, it can't compare to the punishment of getting raped in prison. That's another thing. But, you know, yet you don't just get raped by men, no less, but you also have to be you have to be in prison on top of getting raped. So even if you murder someone or rape someone and you get sent to prison, your punishment is way worse than what you did to the rape victim or the murder victim, because you're not just getting raped once, you're getting raped over and over and over again, and you're having to spend time in prison, along with all the other negatives that come along with prison, and the lack of, you know, pleasant things that come along with being in prison. You know, the rape that you suffer in prison is punishment enough, but then they make you spend years and years in prison on top of it. You know, like if you ever get raped in prison, they should let you out immediately, because you've already served your time at that point. You know what I'm saying? But they don't even really let you sue over having been raped in prison, even though the government and the corporations are completely responsible for you being raped in prison. But they don't let you seek redress for what was done to you. And government clearly doesn't give a shit about prison rape, because government is pure evil. Government could have spent more money to house prisoners safely so that prison rape never happens. But then the government would have to either raise taxes or house fewer prisoners, and would thus need to repeal a lot of tyrannical laws, allowing the people to have their freedom back. But the government doesn't want us to be free. It wants us enslaved. And so it doesn't want to repeal all the tyrannical laws, and it cannot afford to spend more money housing the prisoners more safely, and so it reveals the fact that is both tyrannical and callous by continuing to allow prison rape to happen, even though it's completely preventable. You know, that proves the government is pure evil. Every rape that happens in prison is a horrific crime that the government is 100% responsible for, or that the corporations that the government farms the prison you know, industrial complex out to, private prisons, like then the corporations and the government are responsible if a rape happens in prison. You know, if you have a child and you merely neglect to watch your child carefully enough, you're still watching your child, just not carefully enough, and then your child gets in trouble and gets hurt, you can have your child taken away from you by the government, acting like you're an unfit parent, right? But the government can literally let huge numbers of men get sexually assaulted each year while those men are in government custody, and yet the government is not held the slightest bit responsible. And isn't it ironic that this same evil government that lets men get raped and doesn't take responsibility for it and doesn't change anything so that it doesn't happen anymore, doesn't do anything to change it, doesn't do anything to stop it from happening, this same evil government, this same wicked government acts like it has the moral superiority to take kids away from parents if the parents are anything less than stellar parents. Talk about hypocritical. Talk about insane. Talk about tyrannical. By tolerating prison rape, government is a rapist. Government is the #1 rapist in America. No other rapist comes anywhere close. Not even pedophiles like that British guy who was close with the Queen and is said to have molested over 200 children. I think his name was Seville. Maybe his first name was Jimmy Seville. Whatever his name was. You know, everybody who learned about Pizzagate learned about him. I just have a terrible memory, so I can't remember his full name. But yeah, even that guy doesn't come anywhere close to, you know, the raping power of government. And those mental, emotional wounds from having been sexually assaulted those are psychological wounds that never go away. You know, rape is said to be a crime worse than death for a very good reason, because those psychological wounds never go away. It's because the psychological wounds never fully heal. So government is doing something far worse than the criminals themselves did to get thrown into prison, right? Like, even if the guy was a rapist, he probably only raped one girl and did it just one time. But the people in prison who get raped are raped over and over again. And so the government doesn't just rape people, it serially rapes people. If a rapist, like some skinny 24-year-old guy, rapes some 19-year-old girl and then gets prosecuted, convicted, and thrown into prison, he's raped in prison. He only raped one girl one time, but yet he is raped over and over and over again in prison. So his punishment is infinitely worse than the crime that he committed, especially considering he's suffering from rape from the gender that he's not even attracted to, which is far worse than being raped by someone of the gender that you are attracted to, because it's a violation of your very nature. So how is it necessary or justifiable to make people suffer a far worse punishment than the one they inflicted on someone to get thrown into prison in the first place? If it was wrong for the 24-year-old rapist to rape the 19-year-old girl, then why are we having him be raped multiple times by guys as punishment, and then making him spend years more in prison? You know, why not just kill the 24-year-old rapist? It'd be far more humane and far more morally justifiable than throwing him in a rape factory called prison. And even when the 24-year-old rapist gets out of prison, he's not only labeled a felon, and thus his life and career and prospects are utterly ruined, but he has to live with far worse memories than his victim has to live with. Yeah, she has to live with the memory of being raped, but he has to live with the memories of being raped by guys, over and over, by many guys, right? So his memories that he has to live with after he gets out of prison are way worse than the memories she has to live with, right? Because he's not even gay. So the 24-year-old rapist's torture continues even after he gets out of prison, because those kinds of psychological wounds never really heal. So, what he did to the woman is horrible, but what happened to him is infinitely worse than what he inflicted on his victim. And it would have been fair to execute him, but it is not fair or humane to throw a rapist in prison so that he can be raped over and over by sadistic, sex-hungry guys. They claim that prison is rehabilitation, but that's ridiculous. Prison is not rehabilitation, it's the opposite. People get far worse in prison, and then either they go back to the outside world far worse than ever before, both in terms of criminal knowledge and skill, and in terms of psychological callousness and cruelty, because of the forge of prison having made them harder, colder, etc., or they don't get out of prison, and then the prisoners left in prison for every new prisoner having to deal with are the very worst, because they become the hardest because they're never getting out of prison. So they make prison hell for everyone else who's only supposed to be there for a shorter period of time. These lifers terrorize other prisoners with beatings, rapes, threats, theft of food, etc., etc. And low IQ people tend to commit more crimes, and so when they get out of prison, they might breed, thus passing on their low IQ genes. And low IQ people are more reckless, and thus they end up having more kids, and those kids become criminals. And thus, if you want to prevent more low IQ people from being born, then just deal out the death penalty more often and get rid of prisons. So there's a eugenic effect of having a very robust death penalty as well. The recidivism rate would be much lower as well. And when I say a death penalty, I'm not talking about necessarily administered by government. You can talk about death penalty being administered by individuals in an ANCAP country. So I'm just talking about, punishing crimes with death. I'm not talking about government death penalty, right? The recidivism rate would be much lower as well if we punish people with things by whipping, cutting off a finger or hand, and executing, right? People would make a mistake one time and then they'd never do it again, right? But that's not the way prison is. Prison often doesn't stop people from, doing it again. And plus, a lot of people, as horrible as prison is, like, if you're not getting raped in prison, you have friends or you're strong or whatever, like, that's not going to stop you from going back to prison when you get out, because, like, it's a situation of, like, you become so used to prison, you're not even good at life outside anymore, so you can't really cope with life outside, especially since life outside is getting harder and harder for everybody else who never even ended up in prison. Life is getting harder. So imagine how much harder life is for people in prison when they get out of prison, right? So, like, they get out, they can't do anything, and then they go right back in, because it's like, well, I may as well commit a crime and get thrown back in because I don't really care, because, I can't deal with the outside world because I've been in prison so long, right? And regarding prison, we live so in many ways, getting rid of prison would be a good thing. And regarding prison, we live in an invisible prison these days. Like George Carlin said, we have meaningless choice. Of tons of different kinds of ice cream or whatever else. But when it comes to the important stuff, we get no choice. We get a choice between Skull and Bones presidential candidate number 1 or Skull and Bones presidential candidate number 2. Or between CIA presidential candidate number 1 or CIA agent presidential candidate number 2. We get no choice about what's important. We only get tons of choice about what's not important. I think people need to realize that in the future we'll be given even more quote-unquote freedom to make our slavery even harder to see. But the true and important freedom will be genetic in the future, and they will not let us have certain genes or do certain things with genetics, and thus we will be genetically enslaved in the future. We will be able to do whatever we want, even in like social terms, but we won't be able to make our descendants free by giving them good genes. Or the technology for genetically engineering people will be so expensive or difficult to acquire that it may be legal, but it will be as difficult to do as if it were illegal. So the rich and powerful will stay rich and powerful, and the sheeple will stay sheeple, even though the sheeple will be, in terms of what they're legally allowed to do, freer than ever before. And they will think that they're free, because they'll be way freer than we are today, but they'll be no more free than they are today. Slavery merely expands and expands. It gets more and more subtle. It doesn't go away. It could be abolished, but it would take time. It would take sacrifice of time and money and maybe even lives to get true freedom back. And until we're genetically engineering everyone to have roughly equal IQs, equal memories, equal health, equal beauty, and equal charisma, we will never be free. We need genetic equality in order to be free. And we also need no laws in order to be free. And we also need control over equal technology infrastructure, like each small part of a city having its own genetic engineering place. Or not each city, but like each little cul-de-sac or something having its own, genetic engineering center or something, you know what I mean? So that everyone has control over genetic engineering instead of one company controlling everything or a government controlling it or whatever. Or a few companies controlling it all and then the government controlling them. That's bad. better to have a bunch of independent little centers that do genetic engineering so that it can't be subverted or controlled, so that everybody can, genetically engineer their kids however they want, right? Only if we have equal genes, no laws, and decentralized abundant technology so that no one controls technology, only then can we be truly free. And now finally, a short little thing with some Illuminati symbolism. On an episode of the 2020 version of RWBY, the one with Camilla Sodi, it showed a tablet, and on the back of the tablet, the TV show chose, like they always do, to cover up the company logo that made the tablet, but they did it with a sticker like they always do. And the sticker of this sticker was a Triforce, although within the Triforce was another triangle. So it was more like a Triforce and a Triforce, kind of. But yeah, so that's a little different than a Triforce, but at the same time, it was kind of like two Triforces, right? Because it was like a triangle inside of a circle, and then inside that triangle was a triangle pointing the opposite direction, like it had a right side up triangle pointing upward, and then it had an upside down triangle pointing down inside that one, and then inside that one was another right side up triangle, right? So that was, in my opinion, that's clear Illuminati symbolism. So that was all I had to say in this video. This has been Redshift. Do your part, make videos, or else there's little reason and no reason why I should make videos. Peace trucks for politicians.